Now we're going to get into the local control funding formula. And this is the process by which the state takes state and local taxes and sends it off to school districts. So what is LCFF? I want to just get started at the very highest level with that. LCFF is a state law, and I'm going to call it LCFF. Abbreviating is the local control funding formula. It's a state law that dictates how much funding each district is going to get per student. And what's interesting about LCFF is that it funds students of different demographics differently, essentially providing more equitable funding for students that have been historically underserved by California's education system. LCFF funding has three major parts to it. The first is the base grant. The base grant is giving to basically every student in the state. It's not exactly every student. There are some super high wealth districts that kind of opt out of this. But for the most part, every student in the state is going to get a baseline $8,800. And that's going to vary by grade level. I think kindergartners and then high school students actually get more, and there's less money for students in the middle, but I don't quite recall off the top of my head. But on average, it's about $8,800 that's just gonna come to the district for every single student they serve from the state of California. Then there's what's called the supplemental grant. And so for students in poverty, for English learners, and for foster youth, the state's going to provide an additional 20% of the base grant called a supplemental grant. So if you're doing the math on that, you're talking about an additional $1,700 that the state of California is going to give for districts for every student in poverty, every English learner, every foster youth. The idea being that that extra money is going to help those students who have been historically underserved by our system to achieve better outcomes, right? And then you have the third category, which is the concentration grant. And so districts that have large proportions of students who are of those three groups I described earlier, so those are students in poverty, foster youth, or students who are English learners, those districts are going to receive a concentration grant. That grant is going to get given, the way that grant is distributed to districts, that every student above that 55% threshold, you hit the 55%, your next student, you get 65% of the base grant amount, right? So 65% of $8,800. So I've made these sized based on how much a district could receive per student. The thing to remember is that the concentration grant can be a substantial amount for students, but it only kicks in after that 55% mark. So you've got to have those high concentrations of students. The idea being that districts that have such high concentrations of these students actually have substantial additional need over and beyond what the supplemental grant can provide. And so those districts get this kind of additional funding for those students. I want to stop here actually for just a second and ask if anyone has any questions they either want to just put in the chat or like if the team has anything. It's a pretty important kind of concept to understand these three funding sources, I think, because we're going to get into a minute is a lot of the advocacy that folks are allowed to kind of use to put pressure on school districts actually comes around how these supplemental and concentration grant dollars are spent. And so I just want to take a second for folks to like look at this. And if there are any questions, if you want to just toss them in the chat. I've got one, hang on. Yeah, these thresholds are set by state law. So, and they can be modified. So in the 21-22 state budget, actually, they chose to modify LCFF to expand the concentration grant amount to 65%. I think before it was either 55 or 60%, I can't remember. So they expanded the amount that concentration grants give per student. And so the state legislature determines that. So getting back to, this is how state money gets to districts. The state legislature determines how that money goes through the pipeline. Cool. If there are other questions, throw them in the chat, please. I want to make sure that folks are kind of sticking with me here. So the question I want to talk about for a second is like, does this work, right? The idea here is that districts can get this additional money to better serve low-income students that are foster youth and English learners. But like, does that do anything? And so there have been a bunch of studies on this. This has been around for 12-ish years, something like that. And what they found is that LCFF does result in more money going to higher need districts from the state. It also does suggest that we are seeing improved outcomes for the groups of students that LCFF is targeting. But the problem comes in a little bit of the detail, right? So a 2020 study looked at 14 districts in California. And basically what they found is that only 2 were actually spending that LCFF money in proportion to the students generating the funds, right? So they might have been spending more money on English learners, they might have been spending more money on low-income students, but it wasn't the amount that those students were actually generating for the district, which means that there's some inefficiency in LCFF, right? That some of that money that's meant to serve those students, that's provided to the district because they have English learners, because they have foster youth, because they have low-income students, is actually going to students who don't meet those criteria, right? Is what this study found. So this is a picture that I took from one of our lovely West Contra Costa team's actions, because one way that districts can kind of be held accountable for this is if folks are paying attention, right? What the West Contra Costa team found is that West Contra Costa wasn't spending an appropriate amount of money on, I think this was specifically around low-income African-American students, that they weren't getting the funding that they were actually generating for the district, right? And so they pushed the district to pass policy to say, we're going to spend a larger percentage of that money actually directly serving the students who are generating those funds. And so to your question of like, who's accountable? How do we hold folks accountable? This is one way of doing it at the school board level, right? But there are other ways as well. So districts need to prepare a local control and accountability plan that's actually showing how they're spending that LCFF money. But the LCAP is a really flawed process. It's simply not, it's meant to be this accountability tool that's supposed to allow the community to understand how districts are spending these dollars. And I think for 3 reasons, it just doesn't work. So the first is that LCAPs they get approved by county offices of education. That's kind of the, directly to your question, Deep, like who is the authority? It's the county office of education that looks at the LCAP and says, is the district spending money in line with kind of the students that are generating the funds? But they're often not held to a very high standard of ensuring that the dollars are kind of directly in service of those students, like dollar for dollar. And I would say that in many districts across the state, in many counties across the state, there's a little bit of rubber stamping that goes on, where there's just not a lot of oversight unless you have like dramatic overspending or dramatic misspending, right? LCAPs are also regularly like hundreds of pages long. I think the first one I saw was something like 244 pages. They're these incomprehensible documents. They're often not translated. They're just not accessible to your average community member trying to understand how these dollars are spent, right? Some districts do better than others. Some districts provide summaries, some do great graphical representations. It's just not across the board. There's no state law that says you need to do these things to make them more accessible. And finally, there's not at this point, LCAP is a plan. So essentially it's a document that gets prepared. It's typically prepared by folks at the district with community input. So the LCAP needs to be, it's not a body. It's not like a group of people. There are people that inform the LCAP, right? There are kind of district committees that are specifically assembled to inform the local control and accountability plan process. So in general, the LCAP requires that the district engage community members. There are set kind of committees that they need to assemble to specifically think about how they're going to better serve English learners, for instance, things like that. It's less a group of people and more something that's prepared by the district, I would say. And I would say that the degree to which districts defer to their various LCAP committees varies a lot. There's just not a lot of standardization around ensuring that these bodies that do get assembled have like a meaningful say in how the plan gets made. I think it's to Natalie's point, like it's hard to require this, right? That the district listen to parent or community input. It's hard for the state to say like how do you prove you're doing that or not? It's just a little bit of a flawed process from my perspective. It just doesn't, it's meant to be this accountability tool that I think for a lot of reasons just isn't a very accessible way for community to have meaningful accountability. Gilberto, sorry, I'm looking at your question. Shouldn't the standard operating procedure for any district be some self-assurance or self-testing that it's spending money in compliance with LCFF? That's what the LCAP is trying to do. The LCAP basically says, we're spending this money on this, it's to serve this group of students. We're spending this money on this, it's meant to serve this group of students. The problem is that the document is poorly binding. The districts are essentially setting goals, but those goals can be modified. They can meet or not meet those goals. Like there are various reasons why that like kind of self-monitoring and self-testing like isn't always the most effective, right? It's also just because like funding a school district is complicated, right? It's like difficult and requires a lot of kind of moving on your feet, and it is going to require some, we're going to talk through the school district budget process in a little bit, and like it's hard at any given point in time to know like how much money do we really have, how much money can we really spend. Are there other things that are going to come up? Are we going to have a pandemic and going to have to shift funds to do that, right? Like there are all these different questions that come up. And so that self-testing, that goal setting just doesn't always become a reality. So I think that's part of it as well. Okay, I'm going to move us on. Oh, I actually do want to talk through one more thing here, which is that one thing that does happen is that there are legal groups out there that have sued around the local control funding formula, and that have basically said, hey, District X, we don't think you're using this bunch of funding in a way that's allowable under LCFF. There's been a lot of kind of back and forth over time about whether you can use LCFF on teacher salaries, for instance, in a district that is that has like a high concentration of low-income students, of English learners. The idea being that like, well, we're hiring more teachers, and with this funding, we're attracting better teachers with this funding, and that's going to impact every student, including low-income students. And what a number of legal groups have said basically is like, nah, it's not good enough. You need to directly serve those students. You can't serve the general population. And so there are lawsuits that have gone on kind of trying to get at what is allowable LCFF spending, what's not allowable LCFF spending. So we're gonna get into some more around like accountability later, but I think overall, like, there's work to be done at the state level around establishing better avenues for accountability on this front, in my opinion. Other folks might feel a different way. In this section, I also just wanted, I didn't have a great place to put this, and so I wanted to talk about it here before we move on, is a couple of voter approved funding sources. So these are in addition to LCFF. They're going to supplement LCFF, but I want to talk about bonds real quick, and I want to talk about parcel taxes. So these are both voter approved funding sources. They're things that require, you got to put it on a ballot. A certain percentage of voters have to say, yes, we authorize this tax, or we authorize the district to spend this money, right? Bonds are, it's funding gained through like a long-term increase in property taxes. And the mechanism for that is that it allows the district to take out loans essentially. And then the taxpayers kind of pay the interest on those loans over time, more or less. And these are only for building, repairs, and construction. You can't, bond funding often is like millions and millions. It seems like really big numbers. It's like, oh, great, we're getting all this money for schools. You're literally getting that money for schools, not for students directly. So you can't use bond funding to, staff up a school building, right? You can't use bond funding to expand tutoring programs. Bond funds are really just used for building, repairs, and construction. They also only require a 55% majority, not the 67% that we're going to talk about in a second for parcel taxes. Parcel taxes are funding that you get from establishing a new local property tax. So a parcel is a parcel of land in this context. And parcel taxes will often say something like, for every parcel of land, we're going to charge voters $300. And they're going to take all that money, and they're going to say, we're going to use all this money for X. And they're going to put on the ballot what they're going to use that money on. And it can be anything, right? They can essentially write this as general as they need to be a slush fund for a school district, or they can get specific to say, we're going to fund middle school arts programs, right? And that's it. And that's what this parcel tax is for, and nothing else, right? And so depending on how parcel taxes are kind of written, how they're put on the ballot, can give districts more or less flexibility with how to use that money. Parcel taxes are going to typically have an expiration date as well. So it's often 6 years, 8 years, 10 years, something like that, where it's like, we're going to collect this money for this amount of time, but it's not going to be in perpetuity. It's not going to be a forever investment. And that, like we talked about with Prop 13, is going to require a 67% majority. So there are districts across the state get tons and tons of parcel taxes passed, right? And that can create discrepancies in how districts are funded. Because if wealthier places decide they're going to pass lots and lots of parcel taxes, those schools are going to be better funded than school districts where that's just not possible. Okay, that is part 2 here. I want us to head back to the Jamboard for a second. Let's grab some more learnings. Let's grab some more questions, and we can reassemble in just a couple of minutes here. Yeah, so I see one question here about, is the LCFF money not restricted to funding programs for the students who the funds were provided for? And the answer is kind of, right? The answer is that it's intended to operate that way, but that you can fund programs that provide services to a more general group of students if you can justify it in your LCAP, essentially, right? So you can say, if the services are something along the lines of like, at every school where there are more than 90% English learners, we're going to provide 3 additional after school tutors or something like that, right? And you might be able to get by saying in your LCAP, like, cool, that's an English learner service. Like, these are tutoring programs that are specifically, meant around English proficiency and literacy. But you could end up with some of the 10% that aren't English learners, like in those programs as well, right? And so there's some flexibility on the edge cases, I would say, and that's where you get into some of the inefficiency I was talking about. And V, to your question, welcome, and we will be sending this out, and we're recording all this, so there'll be a recording of all this stuff as well. Cool. I'm seeing some questions here. If my site is entitled to a certain budget and I see that he does not receive the services that he occupies, what can be done? Yeah, it's a really good question. So I think that at a large scale, right? Like, if this is happening throughout the entire system, like, there are legal avenues, right? You can't, I don't believe, I'm not a lawyer, let me say that for the record. I don't believe you can sue on an individual basis for like, my child generated X dollars for the district, and like those X dollars are not being spent directly on my child, right? Because the district, like, there are like lots of things that go on at the district that don't directly provide services to your child, right? There are, district-wide janitorial services that are ensuring that the school is like a clean and safe place to be. Like, that's not money that's directly spent on your child, but it's money that's kind of supporting the overall environment. So I don't think that that there's likely a legal avenue on that front, but I do think if you're seeing it throughout the entire system, that some of the advocacy we talked about earlier is a question, right? To do some of the work to understand, we're looking at, maybe you're looking at English learners, right? And you're saying, how much money is generated by all the English learners in our district? How much money is the district spending on English learner services? Or even you can have a more expansive view of that, right? How much are they spending on a stronger English curriculum? How much are they spending on, all the things around supporting English learners, and try to understand, like, are those two things in line? You can also look at the LCAP and basically see, what does the district say they're spending money on in the LCAP? Which of these things apply in my child's situation? And am I seeing some of these? But like I said, the LCAP is not an easy document to work through, right? It's long, it's complicated, it's not often translated. And so there's just complexity there, and it just requires work, which is, I wish I had a better answer for you, right? Like, I wish I had an answer that was like, you can press this button and like, it's all gonna get fixed. It's not the case, right? It's just a flawed system in this way. That's been my experience, at least. Why was race not included as a category in the use of English learner as a category may in effect serve as a proxy for ethnicity? It's not, I mean, I would say that it's not proxy for a specific ethnicity, right? I would say that there are a variety of folks of different ethnicities who, you can be an English learner from anywhere in the world who comes here and is a newcomer, right? And doesn't speak English. So I know that functionally most English learners in West Contra Costa are Latinx students, but there are across the state substantial portions of Asian English learners. I think that part of why they couldn't use race is probably an equal protections issue. Not a lawyer, but I think that's likely it. A couple of years ago, there was an initiative to try to get the lowest performing subgroup that is not already captured in LCFF to be an additional LCFF group, which functionally would have made non-low income Black students captured as well. But that didn't pass. And I'm not sure if there were equal protections issues there. So I think that's likely what's going on there. And are there examples of districts making LCAP results easily accessible? There are some good ones. I'll see what we can put together kind of after this meeting, and see what we can dig up. But there are districts that put together like infographics and things. And there are trade-offs with all this, right? Like, if you're putting together a one-page infographic, you're missing some important detail along the way as well. And so you kind of want both for different purposes. There's a lot of good info in those 250-page documents. It's just who's going to go through that, except for like me, who, like, I get paid to do that, right? When I was working at Go, it was part of my job to like look through this document. Like, you can't expect a random community member to do that. It's unsustainable. It's not fair. And so I think they both have their value, and but you want both. So we'll try to dig some stuff up there as well. I think that's all we got for now. Let's move on.